Soul-utions, answering those age-old questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens after we die? Is there a God? What about heaven and hell? What can we learn from science about the answer to all these questions? And most importantly, once we really know, remember we are souls, how shall we live? How does that shape our thoughts, actions, and deeds? Here with us tonight, as I say, a giant in the field of near-death experiences, Dr. Ken Ring, Ph.D., Professor Emeritus of Psychology at University of Connecticut, the co-founder and past president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies, founding editor of the Journal of Near-Death Studies, author of a number of books. I've read them all over the years. They're excellent. Life at Death, Heading Toward Omega, The Omega Project, and his most two recent, which we'll be discussing tonight, Mindsight, Near-Death and Out-of-Body Experiences in the Blind, and Lessons from the Light. Fascinating stuff. Dr. Ring's work is endorsed by everyone in the field, basically. Carolyn Mace, Raymond Moody, Charles Tart, Stanley Krippner, Fred Allen Wolf, you name it. Dr. Ring, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you, first of all, for your work. I don't think anyone can appreciate all the hours you put in your research, in your writing, and one of the things that stands out in my reading about your work is the shift in public perception from death, which was characterized as the Grim Reaper when I was young, and now how so many people are envisioning death as the light. And your work has a whole lot to do with that shift. So congratulations and thank you for that from many people.
You're very kind, Mark. I certainly agree with you, not about the importance of my work, but about the effect that all the publicity and all the research on near-death experiences has had in shifting people's view of death away from the idea that it is something horrific and frightening and just full of images of the Grim Reaper, as you say. I think, in effect, the light or the being of light that is so often associated with near-death experiences has almost come to eclipse the Grim Reaper. And the light now, I think, is more the dominant symbol of death rather than the Grim Reaper.
Yes, and I believe that will have great ramifications in time to come in decreasing fear and removing that conscious and subconscious fear of death that has held so many people back in so many ways.
I think it's not only going to have an effect in that direction. I think it already has had that effect. We've done some studies, and other people have too, showing that people who become familiar with the near-death experience and learn some of its lessons and implications, not only for life but for the possibility of life after death, show exactly the kind of shift that you're predicting.
Well, there's so much to discuss. Let's jump right in and first talk about Mindsight, which for listeners is a book explaining the research and the implications of the research with people who have been blind, who are blind, some congenitally blind, blind from birth, who've had near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. So, Ken, could you just briefly summarize the research and then your conclusions about that?
Well, very briefly, Mark, we interviewed about 30 people who were blind, many of them blind from birth. We were interested to find out whether they had near-death experiences and also, and particularly, whether they ever claimed to be able to see during these experiences. And what we found is that blind persons that we interviewed had classic near-death experiences of the same kind that sighted people had reported for years. And 80% of the people that we talked with claimed to have some kind of visual impressions during their near-death experiences, or sometimes their out-of-body experiences. And in a few cases, we were able to corroborate through independent evidence that the things that they claimed to be able to see, that they could not know by normal means, in fact, were in their physical environment at the time.
Just a lack of oxygen to the brain, I guess, huh?
Well, of course, I don't think it's so simple. In fact, I think it's a real stumper for conventional theories of neuroscience to try to explain how blind people, who by definition cannot see, somehow have these visual impressions and report them very reliably. Sometimes they do say that when they were first aware of being able, quote, to see in the physical environment, they were shocked, they were stunned, they were frightened by all this unfamiliar input. But when they got into the more transcendental portion of the experience, where they enter into a world of light and see deceased relatives and so forth that are very common perceptions in this realm of the experience, there they would say that typically that seeing was natural. It was the way it was supposed to be, they'd say. So we found these findings. We found these comments on the part of near-death experiencers to be quite provocative.
Now, I know over the years I've read about similar research by Stan Groff. Larry Dossey talks about some classic cases. I feel like standing on top of the highest building in the world and just yelling, "Hello, is anyone out there listening or reading the literature?" I mean, doesn't this pretty much prove it right there?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Stan Groff, Mark, because I was just at a conference to honor the work of Stan Groff, who's been one of the premier people in the field of consciousness research for over 30 years now. And I began my talk, which was about this particular book that you mentioned, Mindsight, by quoting him to the effect that the blind could see during these experiences. And I think that the research that we have come up with in this book, I don't say it proves anything necessarily in any absolute sense, but as I say, I think it makes a very strong argument that many traditional religious and spiritual beliefs about what may happen at and after death, and particularly the elimination of certain handicaps or limitations that we have in life being removed, I think it makes a very strong case for those kinds of effects.
Has anyone come up with any other type of explanation for this?
Mark, in our study, we had a panel of vision experts, vision specialists, ophthalmologists, and other students of vision. None of them was able to come up with any kind of explanation from a conventional medical point of view that could explain our findings, and so far as I know, no one else has. We published, came out with our book, and by the way, the book was found by my colleague Sharon Cooper. We published various articles in journals and so forth, and I have not yet received a letter from anyone that has essentially offered an alternative interpretation to the one that we propose in our book.
Now, I understand as a scientist, you can't say this absolutely proves it, but again, to the layperson, it's basically proof. I know scientifically you can only go so far and say this suggests, the evidence suggests.
Right. Well, because I do regard myself as a scientist, but I've also always tried to present my work in an invitational spirit, by which I mean I invite people who come to have an interest in near-death experiences to read the literature, to talk to near-death experiencers themselves, and I think that's really the best way, and essentially come to their own conclusions. I don't feel it's my job to tell people what I think the experience means. I only feel that my job primarily is to present the evidence as impartially as I can, to try to present the cases as that are representative of those that I study, and allow people really to come to their own interpretations of what these findings mean. But privately, if I don't have my scientist hat on, I do feel the evidence is very persuasive about the authenticity of these experiences. And in the other book that I wrote recently that you mentioned in your introduction, Lessons from the Light, I actually have 3 chapters that really try to present the evidence for the authenticity of this experience for anybody who is not merely skeptical, but people who are critically minded about these experiences, but open at least to considering them. And I think the evidence in these 3 chapters is pretty persuasive that we have a real phenomenon here.
Especially in combination with other research, for example, after-death contacts, especially the validation confirmation types in which more than one person sees it, information that could not be known any other way, past life regression information from Brian Weiss and others, Ian Stevenson's research on reincarnation. When it's taken all together, I'm convinced personally there's so much information out there.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mark. There are lots of different lines of evidence that people can draw on, and these lines of evidence converge like the streets that lead to the Arc of Triumph in Paris. All these different avenues come out, and they all lead to the same place, and I think that's pretty much the same thing for the different types of research that you mentioned. In fact, again, in one of my books, Lessons from the Light, I draw on some of this information also not just near-death experiences. For example, the work of Bill and Judy Guggenheim on what are called after-death communication, where people have extremely realistic vision or perceptions of deceased persons, in some cases recently deceased persons, who communicate to them in an incontrovertibly convincing way that they still exist on the other side of the veil, so to speak. This kind of evidence dovetails very nicely and almost perfectly, I think, with the implications of the near-death experience.
And with us tonight, providing a ton of scientific evidence that there is life after death, there is a continuation of consciousness beyond this physical body, Dr. Ken Ring, and we're discussing his two most recent books, Mindsight and Lessons from the Light. All of his books would be available from any fine bookstore. So, Dr. Ring, before the break, we were talking about Mindsight. Any other comments or information you'd like to share about that?
Well, Mark, I wonder whether you might be interested just to hear one a typical story of a blind person who had one of these experiences. Would that be of interest?
Yes, go right ahead.
Well, I'd like to tell you then one story of a woman named Vicky. She was born after only 6 months in the womb, and as a result of having too much oxygen in the incubator, she had her optic nerve destroyed, so she never had any vision whatever. At the age of 22, she was involved in a serious, nearly fatal automobile accident. What she remembers is finding herself in the hospital, out of her body. She was able to see her physical body down below her. She recognized it because her hair was cut, and she was very angry about that. She also recognized that it was her body by the fact that she had a very distinctive wedding ring that she only knew by description and touch, and she was able, in this case, to see it. She floated very rapidly above her body, up toward the ceiling, and then through the ceilings of the hospital, through the roof of the hospital. She was able to, she said that she was aware of lights around her, buildings that all passed very fast. She was stunned by this vision, but she then went in through a tunnel, again very fast, and she came out of the tunnel into a beautiful lit realm. She landed on some grass, again with a wonderful feeling of ecstasy and freedom. She saw approaching close to her two young women whom she knew when she had attended a school for the blind, both of whom had predeceased her. They were, both of them, very badly deformed in life, but they looked perfectly healthy and radiant and alive in this state. She also saw two other older persons approaching her. These were her caretakers when she was young, and these people had also died. All of these people came toward her with feelings of great love and welcoming. And she said that she made a motion toward these persons, but before she could reach them, an enormously brilliant, illuminated being, whom she understood to be Christ, interposed himself and essentially told her that she couldn't go any further into this experience, that she had to go back and have her children. And she wanted desperately to have children. She eventually did go back and she gave birth to 3 children, but at that point, of course, she didn't have any. But one of the most interesting things about this particular experience was that before she was sent back by this being of light that she took to be Christ, Vicky said that this being told her in exactly these words, "Watch this," the being said. And at that point, Vicky said that she saw virtually everything that had ever happened to her in her life, and the effects of those actions displayed to her in a life review, in a panoramic life review sequence that so many people that have these experiences describe for us. And in this case, of course, she was saying that she could actually see the people in her life, not just be aware of them in some other way. So she had an experience, even though she's blind from birth. She has no concept or no history of vision, of course, doesn't know what it's like to see, and yet during this experience she saw, and she recounts an experience that in almost every respect is identical to those deep experiences that have been described for us for many years by sighted individuals. That's just one example of the sorts of studies or the sorts of experiences that we came up with in the course of our research for the book Mindsight.
And this is is the line that really got me. It says that Lessons from the Light attempts to give away the fruits of the near-death experience tree of knowledge without having to be crushed beneath its trunk in order to obtain them. And that certainly sounds attractive to me. So, Dr. Ring, if you would give us an overview of Lessons from the Light.
Well, Mark, what I was trying to do in this book was to essentially distill and offer the basic insights about what is really important about the near-death experience for people who never have had the experience themselves, but would like to learn from those who have. Of course, I've taught for many years. I've given many lectures on the near-death experience and conferences and so forth, and I often hear from my listeners, how much they envy near-death experiencers and how much they like to have this experience. Of course, they seem to fail to remember that, there's a price you have to pay. You have to nearly die to have it.
Yeah.
And so what I was trying to do in this book is to say, hey, wait a second, you don't have to have this experience in order to benefit from it. You can learn from this experience, and you can learn from those who have had the experience. So what my book attempts to do is it really attempts to offer in very accessible language what the essential insights from the near-death experience are, and it tries to show or help the reader to apply these insights to his or her daily life.
Very good. And you have practical exercises that people can use to help them actually absorb and internalize this information, so it's not just cerebral knowledge?
Yes, exactly, Mark. That's what I try to do. In other words, I talk a lot about near-death experiences, but then I try to show people how by not only just absorbing these stories, but by working with this information, they can apply the lessons of the light to their own lives. And perhaps I could give you just one example of how this might work. I could perhaps best do it by talking a little bit about the life review. I might have to do this over a couple of segments, but I think it would make pretty clear the way I try to use this material in the book to make it available to the readers.
Go right ahead. Sounds very important.
Well, so many people who have near-death experiences say that as a part of it, as I was saying in connection with Vicky's story a moment ago, they have a panoramic life review in which they see virtually everything that they've ever done in their life displayed to them in a kind of holographic surround panoramic vision. And when I say everything, I mean everything. And one of the most extraordinary aspects of this particular life review I can perhaps best illustrate by a brief story. I have a friend who had a near-death experience when he was in his mid-30s. When he grew up, he was a very kind of rambunctious, sort of hot-tempered guy, and he got into a lot of scrapes. And one day, when he was a teenager, driving his truck in a nearby town, he nearly ran down a pedestrian, and they got into a fight. And my friend jumped out of the cab of his truck and punched this guy out and left him unconscious on the pavement, and drove off and never got into any trouble for it. When he had his near-death experience, this particular scene came up for him in his life review, and he said, and so many people talk about it in this way, a part of him was just like high above the building where this fight took place, and he was just sort of watching passively like a spectator.
Soul-utions reminding each one of us that we are shining stars, we are eternal souls, timeless spirits. It's time to remember that, to really know that without a doubt, to let our light shine, to follow our highest truth. That's when we can solve the various challenges of the world and experience that inner peace that passes all understanding. So before the break, we were talking with Dr. Ring about exercises, practices that help us know to really absorb and internalize lessons that people who have nearly died have, and how we can do that without nearly dying ourselves. So go right ahead, please.
Well, Mark, I feel like saying something like, well, when we last left our hero, he was poised over the scene of this fight that was taking place. Of course, this is during his life review, and he's simply watching this fight like a spectator. But another part of him, at the same time, is in the fight, except this time, instead of being himself, this fellow was the other man. And he said to me that he felt all 32 blows that he had inflicted on this other man. Now he was the recipient of those blows, and he, as the other man, fell unconscious to the pavement. So what happens in the life review is that not merely that you see everything that happens in your life, but you see the effects of your actions, and you often experience those effects as though they are done to another person who you now are. Do you understand me? It's like an empathic role reversal. You are all the other people that you have helped. You are all the other people that you have hurt. And this is a very, very profound experience for anybody that goes through it. But it's also profound for people who just know about it. So to get to the point of the lesson, what I do in my book and what I have done in my workshops and classes is I have people read a number of accounts like the story I just told you, except they're much fuller and they're specific. And I have them sort of meditate on those accounts. And then after they spend about 10 minutes thinking and reflecting on these accounts, I have them do a little exercise to begin with the line, when I think of these commentaries in relation to my own life, I, which is the stem of a sentence, and I ask people to reflect on their own lives in light of these commentaries. And I can tell you, Mark, this exercise itself can be a very soul-shattering one for many people. I've seen people weep. I've seen people have the strongest emotions when they look at their lives. Not that they necessarily, that these experiences are meant to scare people or frighten them. They're meant to show them something. They're not meant to feel guilty, and near-death experiences always say that. But they're meant to reveal something about what is important to live. And these experiences wake you up and to make you aware of the effects of your actions in ways that I think just, ordinary religious teachings may never do, because these stories carry a wallop, and many people are affected by them. In fact, I think what I would go on to say is something like this. From my studies of the near-death experience, and I'm sure this has been found by other researchers as well, it's almost like the exposure to the near-death experience is like a benign virus. In other words, by reading about, by reflecting on near-death experiences, you kind of catch it. You kind of have the same sorts of effects from even the exposure to the experience as do people who actually have the experience themselves. That's why I say the reading about the experience acts as a benign virus, kind of spreads the effects, many of which are very beneficial, of the near-death experience to people who have never had the experience themselves. So they can have it sort of one step removed by a kind of contagion effect. Mm-hmm. And this is what I try to do in these exercises. I try to give away the fruits of the near-death experience by allowing people to absorb the lessons of themselves.
And it seems to me that this life review you mentioned, by the way, can be a type of hell. I personally don't believe in eternal fiery hell, and I believe that the negative life review, in fact, the Aramaic language, the language of Jesus, reflected that part of Sheol or Gehenna, the hellish experience, was how people feel, how they experience the negative ramifications of what they did to others.
Well, what people say about the life review sometimes is just seeing yourself as you actually are, and how and some of the cruel or unkind things that one may do even unconsciously, that is a kind of hell. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't. It's not really meant as a punishment. As I said, it's meant really to try to awake people to right action. And it really shows that we are really all connected. And basically, what it shows is not just the value of the golden rule, or not just the golden rule as a precept for moral conduct. It shows you that the golden rule is really the way it works. What we give out to others is what we really receive back. And that golden rule, in one way or another, is found in all of the world's great religions, not just in Christianity.
Yes. And goodness is its own best reward. It's not just a lofty saying. It is actually the way the universe works.
That's right, Mark. And not only that, but, when people have the life review, they experience all the good things that they do for others as though they are themselves the recipients of those actions. And it is a very, very gratifying and wonderful feeling.
Now, you mentioned the term benign virus, and I understand it from reading your book, but can you expound upon that, please, for listeners?
Yes, the studies that we've done, Mark, show that people who are exposed to information about near-death experiences, or who take the trouble to talk to near-death experiencers, begin to show some of the same shifts in values and attitudes and behavior as near-death experiencers themselves do. For example, one of these most consistent and strongest effects of a near-death experience is that people tend to believe almost as if it was a certainty that there is some form of life after death. That's what near-death experiencers believe. What we find for people who study near-death experiences, students in courses and people who have read books on near-death experiences, is exactly the same thing. These people also show a significant increase in their conviction of some form of life after death as a result of their exposure to these materials on the near-death experience. It's in that sense that I say that the near-death experience acts like a benign virus. It communicates its effects to people about near-death experiences who have never had near-death experiences themselves.
And you've seen this transform the life of people who have participated in your workshops and so on?
I've seen many changes reported, not just seen these changes, but we've done studies using questionnaires and interview techniques and so forth, where we've been able to gather information to show that these effects are consistent and they're long-lasting. In fact, if you hang on just 1 second, maybe I just happened to have a letter recently from someone I've never met, but who's read some of my books, and if I have a minute or so, perhaps I can read it just to illustrate this.
Go right ahead.
Now, I want to say something. This sounds a little self-serving, but I mean, he writes some very nice things about me, but I want to put it this way. I mean, he could say the same thing about any of these books on near-death experiences, not just my book, so I don't want to pat myself on the back, but this will illustrate the thesis of the benign virus. And what he wrote is, "You have had a profound and tremendously positive effect on my life. I have never had a near-death experience, but your inspiring writings have moved me to be a much more compassionate person." You're right. As we read and study about near-death experiences and associate with near-death experiencers, we begin to develop more of their wonderful attributes. Your books have changed my life, and in turn have changed my 3 children's lives as I have talked to them about near-death experiences for the past 3 years. I have no doubt whatsoever that your writings will influence people for generations to come. How could they not? Well, I mean, that certainly makes me feel good. But again, I don't want to say this is my book or my writings especially. What I'm saying is all this literature on near-death experiences, all this information, it helps to communicate itself, and the same kinds of very positive changes that occur in the lives of near-death experiencers can happen for people who just take the trouble really to study, to ponder, and to absorb this information for themselves.
Beautiful, yes. The good news is sets us free. We have a break coming up, but after the break, I'll be asking you, Doctor, about some of the unique near-death experiences that you share in Lessons from the Light, about people who have gone beyond the light and encountered a second light, what we call primordial light, maybe finding themselves face-to-face with the Creator, and certainly we'd be interested in hearing about that. People who have gone beyond the first light and encountered a second or primordial light.
Mark, I'll speak to that in just a second. I just want to mention for your listeners that I also have information about my research on near-death experiences in the blind in one full chapter in Lessons from the Light, so they can find that in either book.
Right.
But to speak to your question, at the very end of Lessons from the Light, I talk about some of the deepest near-death experiences that I've encountered. I call these complete or full near-death experiences. And I only have a few of these cases in my book, but they're quite consistent. And generally, what they involve is people have a very profound near-death experience where they encounter the light, and then they go through the light. They go through that light, and they go on what seems to them to be a journey, as best I can put it, a journey into space, into deep space. And all of these people describe eventually coming to a second light. And this second light seems to be primordial. It seems to be the source. It seems to be the fount of creation. It seems to be, I don't want to try to be too extravagant here, but like home. It's like where we come from, and where we always live, where we live in eternity. And people there feel that they encounter directly, well, I'd have to say God. I mean, another word for it, but, the creative energy of the universe, the creative intelligence of the universe. And when they have this encounter, they're filled with a love that's beyond description, and they're also filled with a kind of universal knowledge. It's like all the lessons from the light come from the light directly during this experience. And people can retain this lesson, and they come back, and these near-death experiencers who have this very profound and complete near-death experience have impressed me very deeply by how they lived and by the wisdom that they've been able to absorb. And in my book, I also try to provide what they have to say so that we can learn from these people that have had the experience of the second and primordial light.
Beautiful. Well, Dr. Ring, there is so much we'd like to cover, and listeners, Dr. Ring has agreed to come back in the future again because there's so much I'd like to share of his work with you. But now I know I'm tingling all over because this is a serious scientist, as I say, editor of journals, professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Connecticut. This is the real stuff. This is not wishful thinking. Let that good news seep through every pore in your body and really know that the real you is timeless, eternal. And Dr. Ring, thank you so much for sharing with us tonight your work.
Thank you, Mark. It's been my pleasure to be with you.